Hi, my name is Dr. Joel Jin. We welcome you to this panel discussion titled Co-Creating a Caring Community Through an Inclusive Ethics of Care. Through this panel, my colleagues and I seek to illustrate how we provided a caring community for our students. We hope to demonstrate how we address the mental health needs of our undergraduate and graduate students, but from outside of traditional healthcare avenues. This was in part to address the barriers against mental health that marginalized students often face. The aim was to promote the health and wellness of students during the COVID-19 pandemic and with the rise of anti-Black and anti-Asian racism. Also, we reflect on institutional and psychological challenges to wellness among all institutional constituents. These challenges prompted us to consider how to co-create a caring community together for the present and the future. We begin with a shared positionality statement in our own statements. Then, we respond to reflective questions we crafted for ourselves to guide our discussion on this past year in a roundtable fashion. I'll begin by offering a statement of our shared positionality. We are three clinical and counseling psychologists of East Asian heritage. We come together navigating teaching, research, and service remotely yet in connection this past year. We represent three different academic departments that are situated in a Christian liberal art institution in the Pacific Northwest. Now, each panel member will offer a statement of their positionality, which introduces some of their identities and perspectives that influence their work. We recognize that we cannot fully capture the complexities of all our experiences and identities. Still, we introduce some in hopes of making our implicit assumptions, which drive our work and inform our reflections, explicit. This practice of unveiling is our attempt to make explicit the impact our professional and personal roles and identities have on one another. In other words, to humanize faculty and to address their needs as part of co-creating a caring community.
The work that I'll describe in this presentation is influenced by my personal and professional identities. I'm Korean by birth, but grew up in the Philippines as a missionary kid. The longest I have lived in one place, however, is in the US. Thus, my ethnic identities include a sense of connection to South Korea as my culture of origin, a feeling that Philippines is at my actual home, and an ongoing search to better understand my American identity. This coming together of multiple cultural backgrounds deeply informs the work that I do as an academic. Professionally, first, I'm a counseling psychologist. This means that I'm interested in my students' cultural stressors and mental health outcomes, and also their coping strategies in response to these stressors. More specifically, I study Asian and Asian American experiences of racism and stereotyping. I also research how religion might intersect with some of these experiences to buffer against negative outcomes. How does religion help or exacerbate them? How does religion hurt? As such, in my outreach to students, I'm motivated to clearly name these constructs and help students to respond to them effectively. Second, I teach undergraduate students at a Christian university who are exploring various identities in and outside of the classroom. Faculty's intentional response to various stressors that might arise during the students' undergraduate years can be a formative experience. Third, I chair the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of my academic unit, a committee that is made up of both faculty and student members. In this role of leading the DEI committee, I'm attuned to the needs of my academic unit around diversity issues, especially in resourcing the members of my community and providing intentional support in responding to current events disproportionately impacting our students of color.
Hello, everyone. I appreciate this opportunity to share our background and positions. Who I am and how I show up in my work, including teaching, research, mentoring, administrative work, and in my personal life are intricately connected. I'm an associate professor of counselor education and the director of doctoral programs in the School of Education at Seattle Pacific University. Like Paul, I'm a counseling psychologist by training. Like Joel, I primarily work with graduate students. I do not teach undergraduate students. I grew up in Hong Kong, came to the United States as an international student for my undergraduate education, and later stayed on for my doctorate and started my career in academia. I identify as a cisgender Christian woman. I'm married. I'm a mother. My parents immigrated from mainland China to Hong Kong in the early 1980s. At that time, Hong Kong was still a British colony. So from a young age, I have seen discrimination against recent immigrants like my parents and the oppressive power of colonialism, classism, elitism play out in the education system. This has personally motivated me to want to speak up and give voice to the historically marginalized. The passion has translated into my academic vision and research objectives in eliminating mental health disparities among underserved groups. To do this, I first wanted to understand the mental health and school adjustment issues among Asian and Latinx immigrants. Second, in collaboration with other colleagues, I have developed numerous measurement tools that are culturally and contextually relevant, such as scales that evaluate respondents' subjective gender experience and college students' mental health help-seeking barriers. Third, my colleagues, including Joel here, and I have developed and evaluated the effect of several culturally responsive school or community-based intervention programs for underrepresented groups.
Both professional and personal identities inform these reflections in my work. I'm a child of a Korean immigrant family born and raised in Canada. I completed my graduate training in Southern California, and then I was hired afterwards through an employer-sponsored visa. I identify as a cisgendered able-bodied man, and in my PhD clinical psychology department, I'm the youngest and one of 2 faculty of color. I'm a clinical psychologist with an interest in studying mindfulness-based interventions to address mental health disparities of ethnic minority populations. I identify as a Christian, and moreover, I attended an APA-accredited program at a Christian seminary. As a clinician, I am interested in brief dynamic therapies which highlight the significance of attachment and relationships, holding complex feelings together, and the rise of anxiety. So our first question is related to what were the needs of our students based on an ethics of care and their social locations? And I'm wondering if we can start with you, Dr. Kim, in responding to this question, and we'll go around in our panel discussion here.
Thank you, Joel. At the beginning of the pandemic, when anti-Asian racism was gaining national media attention, I felt that there was a pressing need for Asian and Asian American students to feel intentionally supported. They needed to hear their experiences of racism recognized, named, and condemned as an evil that deeply grieves God. They also needed a place to share resources with each other, provide emotional support, and grieve. And these were racial stressors that were taking place during a time when students were already burdened with the fear of the coronavirus, the stress of unexpected remote learning, and any financial burdens they were experiencing due to the pandemic. Finally, given the unique setting of a Christian higher education institution, I thought that students would also benefit from a multidimensional care that included mental health support and spiritual care.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kim. Our School of Education doctoral program is fully online, and the majority of our students identify as white and racially. And so on the logistical level, students are not as impacted because they are already familiar with the online learning format. However, most of our students are principals, teachers, school counselors, and school district leaders. So they were at the forefront of dealing with a lot of challenges associated with school lockdown during the COVID pandemic. The transition to emergency online learning for their own students was also very stressful. And so the impact, and also on top of it, they were also dealing with the impact of racism and race-based violence on their students and their students' families. And because the doctoral students are giving so much and are doing a lot of emotional labor in their professional lives, when they came to class, I sensed that they really desired for a change of pace, they wanted to be fed, and whether it means that they want to be fed intellectually, to feel supported in their own journeys as learners, to validate and be validated by their classmates, or just to stand in solidarity with other educators. I think that's kind of what they need, and that's the space that I could create and carve out in my class. And for some of the doctoral students, school lockdown also has real impact on their research progress because they were not able to continue with their research. Some of their practicum or internship experiences were also impacted. And so these were some of the needs that I identify within this specific group of students.
And I'll also add from a perspective of working with graduate students, I became aware of their needs while teaching and advising at the beginning of the pandemic. And what's been iterated is that our program has also shifted to teaching remote and online. And students were requesting greater reminders and increased flexibility regarding deadlines as students. And there was also this disconnection and a settling fatigue of relying on video calls, kind of like our conference right now, that it's all virtual and online. So students were varied also in their experience of caring for others who are immunocompromised. They might have been living alone and away from family, or they might still be applying to the next academic milestone. And moreover, they were processing the rise of anti-Black and anti-Asian racism, the 2020 US presidential election, and any local news that's emerging week after week. It was a challenging time to be a graduate student and maintain business as usual. So I think students seem to benefit with greater virtual time, space to connect with one another. In addition, clear and proactive communication was necessary to share, label, validate, denounce racism and discrimination. And these conversations occurred in the classroom and also additional spaces outside of class time as well. Students also needed to be empowered to be active agents against the rise of racism at a community level, or at least voice their concerns as applied to course content as well. We'll move on to the second question that we had for ourselves. How do we respond as faculty of East Asian heritage and as clinical and counseling psychologists as well?
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Based on what I perceived as the needs of the Asian and Asian American students, in partnership with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of my academic unit, I was involved in a few different responses to care for our affected students. One significant effort was to put together a substantive online resource that included a condemnation of anti-Asian racism, suggestions for how faculty might reach out to Asian and Asian American students, and a list of resources for teaching and supporting them during and beyond the pandemic. This resource document now resides on our school website, and faculty and staff from our learning community can continue to add to this document. Another response that was meaningful was to engage in purposeful writing. Often during the pandemic, I found myself venting and writing about the deep pains of anti-Asian racism, but also the failures of others in my community to recognize this as a valid source of distress. These thoughts turned into pieces that were published in outlets that I do not typically publish in. These were more public outlets, such as an op-ed piece in the Seattle Times in a Christian Scholars Review blog post.
Thank you, Dr. Jen and Dr. Kim. As a counseling psychologist, I'm drawn to walk alongside people and encourage them. My professional training has also equipped me with both skills and acumen to be responsive to students' emotional needs during this time. As mentioned earlier, I sense that my graduate students could be vulnerable to emotional burnout because of the professional roles. And so I intentionally carve out time in class for them to process and to talk to each other about what is going on in their lives, in the society. And as a program director, I did regular check-in with all of my students to maintain a sense of connectedness to the program. I helped several of them to think outside of the box, to pivot their research projects, For example, I received a grant last year to identify promising online teaching pedagogy during a time of major crisis, such as the pandemic. My doctoral students were able to collaborate on this grant and also to extend the subject, which has led to several presentations, manuscripts in progress, and a dissertation. Within the SPU community, I also looked to others to collaborate with them. So Dr. Jin here and I collaborated, and Dr. Jin will elaborate on this further. We capitalize on our experience and training as clinical and counseling psychologists to develop a mindfulness-based intervention for historically marginalized students. Externally, I also collaborated with the Anti-Racism Task Force of Division 45 of the American Psychological Association to develop a set of resources for Asian and Asian American families and school-age children to deal with COVID-related racism, harassment, and violence. And the infographics have been translated into multiple Asian languages.
I'll also echo the need and providing and offering one-on-one advising to students and mentoring meetings with graduate students, particularly of color, that this was more than what I had experienced in my first year as a professor. And in particular, I found myself sharing resources of anti-racist trainings with students and workshops with my students of color so that they can develop a sense of agency, that they can act, they can have a voice, and that was important to their health as well. And with a couple of students of Asian heritage, I attempted to offer my emotional support and empower students to act and give voice to the concerns they saw. To be honest, many of these meetings were offering validation and normalization of the afflictions from national news. And at times, these meetings were met with just sharing my own similar grief, anger, and fatigue. I'll also touch on the project that my colleague and I worked on together and support in a research study that was conducting a mindfulness-based seminar for first-generation college students. And we shifted this to be an online intervention study that offered also a course credit. We eventually opened up recruitment not only for first-gen college students, but also any undergraduate student here in our institution. And the enrollment was casted out more widely. And so to help offset the burden of our own counseling center, to offer another extracurricular student support, and to offer a course credit, we were able to provide this mindfulness-based seminar for students. And the training was to practice and experience mindfulness practices for stress management and emotion regulation. And furthermore, our seminar was experiential, and it was discussion-based. And this allowed our undergraduate students to really connect with one another and cultivate a sense of being. I think a shared sentiment, especially for first years who had just begun school and just begun undergraduate and an online format, was that they gained some sense of belonging with one another through this kind of seminar. Okay, we'll move on to our next question of what were our needs and the limitations of an ethics of care based on our social locations as faculty, as professors, as psychologists?
As I shared in my previous responses, I'll focus on working with Asian and Asian American students. During this time of heightened efforts to reach out to our Asian and Asian American students, I found myself also seeking self-care during this time. As someone who is trained in counseling psychology, I deeply understand the critical importance of self-care so that I'm not empty when caring for my students. For self-care, I sought out the support of my academic community, such as an Asian American affinity group that was hosted by our campus ministries. This affinity group allowed me a setting where there was a safe place for me to lament, to vent, and to process emotions around anti-Asian racism with faculty and staff colleagues. Anti-Asian racism should be understood in connection to the experiences of other communities of color, such as the experiences of African Americans in the United States. Given this, I joined Academics for Black Lives, which is an intensive professional learning group that lasted that took place for several weeks. It was a transformative experience of learning about history of racism against Black individuals, examining my own biases and assumptions, and how, as academics, we can contribute to dismantling racist systems. Finally, going deeper, I thought that my own internalized model minority stereotype sometimes got in the way of truly recognizing the validity of anti-Asian racism and its injurious nature. The very thing that I was telling others not to do, don't dismiss or minimize anti-Asian racism, was something that I'm also prone to based on my own identity as an Asian person who perhaps have learned to internalize the model minority stereotype over time. This is a tendency that I have to consistently fight against.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. This was not an easy question for me to answer, as thinking about or identifying my own needs often gets pushed to the background. As a mother of 2 elementary age children, a wife married to a male partner who's also an academic in a competitive institution, even before COVID, I find myself struggling with this type of question, or I find myself to often be the default parent, the primary caregiver, while simultaneously navigating my own career. As one of the few Asian American faculty and women of color on campus, I also tend to bear the brunt of emotional labor for our students and sometimes colleagues. Over this past year, when home and work life were no longer so well defined, I was feeling the increasing strain of multitasking and also realized how little room I had for myself. There was a long period of time when I felt I was just responding to issues, crises, or demands on a daily basis with no capacity to engage in any meaningful conversations. For example, both of my colleagues here mentioned about the opportunity to participate in the Academic for Black Lives training. I was able to log on and listen to all of the recorded sessions while tending to other chores, but I was not able to participate in any of the process groups afterwards. The upshot of having a less defined kind of home work boundary, however, is that my kids were able to see and join in some of the work I do, such as making signs and protesting.
Thank you for that. And just thinking about while caring for students from this ethics of care, a faculty, a teacher, or instructor, we can assume that we have to draw from this inner reserve of energy that is just limitless. And so I hope our stories can illustrate just how much we can be impacted as well in this work. And from my perspective, since I was in my first year as a faculty and straight out of graduate school, I was intimidated, if I'm honest, by the shifts of teaching online due to the pandemic and also navigating the social climate with students. With my limited years of experience, I needed models on how to navigate teaching, scholarship, and service. I also needed mentors and colleagues to process with, which is why I'm so excited to be part of this panel with the 2 colleagues, both Munyi and Paul, who helped me process the rise of anti-Black and anti-Asian racism as an early career psychologist and as a young faculty. Moreover, my service to students and scholarship was enhanced while working with you both. So I never felt alone in that way. So I'm grateful for you both. I also noticed that I benefited from listservs, experts and other researchers and practitioners. So following the Asian American Psychological Association listserv or Division 45 of American Psychological Association, and Twitter accounts of psychologists of color, where they would share their reflections, responses to national news, and offer templates for emails and letters, the unseen, the emotional labor that we faculty get placed to do. And I remember reading a tweet from a respected Asian American psychologist who disclosed he only had a skeleton of a syllabus for his course and would assign readings on a weekly basis, even though the new quarter was just about to start. And this provided a lot of relief in my own course preparation and helped activate my own creativity. How can I be the best professor in this time of crisis and so many shifts? I also grew and became aware of my own biases, partaking in part of Academics for Black Lives, along with other anti-Black racist online trainings by Tima Bryant-Davis. And in a parallel process, I participated in anti-Asian racist trainings and workshops too, similarly working on my own internalized racism, my own biases towards myself. And if I shift from the professional to the personal, say that my wife, who also identifies as Korean American, and I were challenged to validate one another's experiences. As a new faculty and as a newlywed, we were community members as well, and we were consumers of media. And so this points to another assumption of an ethics of care, that faculty remain immutable to their life stressors based on their social positions. So I found myself doing a little less research and to prioritize learning how to continue dismantling anti-Black racism in my field and in academia, along with caring for myself with the negative impacts of anti-Asian racism. And they went hand in hand. Let's shift to this next question regarding how did us working together support our needs that we just articulated? And what did it mean to labor and service together as our own caring community, as we also think about caring for our students as well?
I'll respond with an example based on some work that I did with Joel. So I had an opportunity to co-facilitate a student support session with Joel as faculty members sharing the same larger academic unit, our School of Psychology, Family, and Community, but in different smaller ones. So Joel in clinical psychology department and myself in undergraduate psychology. It was really neat to be able to reach out to all of our students in response to the topic of anti-Asian racism. And the fact that we were representing different departments meant that there were some students who were more familiar to one of us, and we were able to care for our students in a way that might not have been possible if only one of us were present in these sessions. So I really appreciated the opportunity to collaborate with Joel. Partnering with each other to provide care for our hurting students was meaningful to me because it allowed me to live out the truth that if one part of the body is in distress, the other parts must come together to pay attention to the one part. That we were seeking to provide intentional support to the parts of our body, namely Asian and Asian American students, who needed extra attention during this past year due to the anti-Asian racism. Finally, while we ourselves as faculty were part of the hurting and processing the trauma, we were simultaneously benefiting from laboring to care for our own community.
Paul mentioned earlier about self-care as a form of self-compassion and kindness to oneself. And I cannot agree more with that. For me, the first thing is to recognize that these problems we face, faculty, students, staff, are systemic. And therefore, there is a need for us to also examine our own internalized fear and shame. It is not a personal failure when we do not feel well, or when we feel that we are merely surviving but not thriving. It is not because we do not have enough grit. The second thing is to set healthy boundaries. And these are the boundaries that would allow us to exercise control over what we let in, to speak up, and not react defensively when others disagree with us. And students have shared with me how much they appreciate that when I model boundary setting as a form of self-care, even though my initial thought was that I had let them down. Their message to me was really a form of a great encouragement to me. Third, I think it's important to advocate for support for ourselves and also for our colleagues, especially those colleagues who are in a more vulnerable position. For example, personally, I have had long discussions with my partner about our roles and responsibilities as parents. Professionally, within our School of Education, we have reviewed the impact of COVID and the shift to emergency online teaching on our faculty scholarship. and how those expectations may impact, their tenure and promotion. So as a school, how we could respond to those changing needs and how we could either provide faculty with a reprieve or additional resources to support their writing, scholarship, and research.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing both sides of as we support our students, that we also need our own care as well, and they go hand in hand in conversation. So just to add, I had the privilege to work with both of you in different capacities, which sustained my energy throughout this pandemic. And such a coordination broke down those institutional silos that we've talked about, how we're often sometimes so separated, and especially even more when we're virtual and online. And this helped to mobilize our resources for greater student population benefit. And it was helpful as a young faculty to have this kind of encouragement to offer different kinds of supports for students with different mentorship styles and ideas that were not just limited to traditional sources of healthcare to support our students. For example, this kind of support led to the coordination of student support sessions early in the pandemic together, as Paul had mentioned earlier. In addition, we had organized a fireside chat with Dr. Russell Jung, who brought both his sociological and theological perspectives to talk about anti-Asian hate from the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center very early in the pandemic. And then with Munyi, I had this incredible opportunity to be a co-PI on a project that resonated with our scholarship. And so we continue to be researchers and psychologists and scholars, while also providing a direct clinical service for students that was inside a classroom setting. So despite the pandemic, I continued to grow as a scholar and teacher by co-facilitating these mindfulness-based seminars as well. We're going to shift to this next question, one of our final questions about how do you envision a faithful presence for today and the future as an institution? And what would an equitable and inclusive caring community look like to you?
For me, an inclusive and caring community would involve all parts of the body working together for the health of our community, not a select few. Many of us, including all the presenters today, feel a sense of calling to advocate for our own communities. However, this type of work must also be done by white allies as well. A truly inclusive community will have all people working together to address racism instead of a select few. There will also be support from administrators for this type of work.
Yeah, a truly inclusive, equitable, and caring community will invite people to speak to and challenge the ways through which our values, assumptions, biases have led to harmful policy, procedures, and operations that perpetuate the privilege of one group and restrict the development and flourishing of the others. As mentioned earlier, we must recognize that these are systemic issues, and the decision we make have long-term and ripple effect. For example, our institution, in partnership with the School of Education currently, are exploring the feasibility of establishing an early childhood education center that would provide affordable childcare support for our faculty and staff and perhaps students. And the potential impact of having this institutional level support is far-reaching. It has implications for faculty, staff, students, family planning in a city that's very expensive. And the center will provide support for faculty pursuing tenure and promotion by giving them dedicated time to work. It would also provide education students with practical experience. Although this work is hard and may take many years to materialize, it is a tangible way to exemplify our care for building an inclusive and equitable community.
Thanks for sharing both. Final thought is, as we move forward, the inclusion of all institutional constituents, so faculty, staff, and students, seems crucial to co-creating a caring community for our students, but for ourselves as well. We want to create a community that we can thrive in and survive in as well. So I've often wondered, who is caring for the carers at our institution? And in that way, I envision a faithful presence for the future as led by a board and a senior leadership that is attentive to the needs of faculty and staff, that they're also clear and intentional in communication, and they're proactive to offer tangible supports to faculty and staff. Moreover, faculty and staff would benefit from leaders who are aware that those who care for students situate themselves in diverse social locations. We are impacted by the world news and what's going on. And so as a result, when the socio-political climate is negatively impacting students, faculty and staff are negatively impacted as well. And in that way, we hope to just give a picture of what a faithful presence looks like at an institution. Let me briefly summarize before our time of Q&A. Through an ethics of care, we shift our resources and attention to meet student needs as faculty, instructors, and professors. We must see our students holistically when considering their health needs, those who are marginalized in particular. For example, we can intervene in our classrooms through one-on-one advising sessions, with department-wide emails, publicly writing, pivoting research projects, and pooling resources together. But we must be aware of and meet our needs as well, for a faithful presence today and tomorrow. An inclusive ethics of care imagines a caring community for all institutional constituents. Thank you to the program co-chairs for this invitation to come together. Also, I want to honor the emotional and often invisible labor we all have engaged in during this past year.